Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is April 18, 2021. And in this video, we're going to take a look at a tweet from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez posted December 11, 2020, currently still her pinned tweet as of today, in which she posted about a 3-minute video discussing her accomplishments during her first term as a congressperson. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe and consider supporting us on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So I'm going to play the video in full in just a minute so that everybody knows what we're talking about. But before I do, I just want to preface this with, where are we coming from in April 2021 as far as discussing the Democratic Party, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, etc. So to start things off, this is a socialist channel, specifically Marxist. We're not social democrats, just, trying to co-opt the word socialist. We're actually socialist in the historical sense of that term. And as such, we want to end capitalism. What is that? That is where industry is owned privately, operated for profit, with very little input from the workers who actually produce the goods and services, which capitalists take as their own private property and then just turn into capital or money for themselves to exchange rather than to use. We want the working class to be in control of society and in control of industry, and we want to phase out as rapidly as possible the practice of capitalism and the existence of the capitalist class. In fact, we would say that in 2021, this process is long overdue. Industry has been developed to a point where this was possible decades ago, and in fact, we need to really hurry up and get it done. So from that perspective, how is working within the Democratic Party going? Fucking useless. That would be, to sum it up, fucking useless. We have watched a decline in working class power over decades now. Decades. Which the Democratic Party, hand in hand with the Republican Party, has overseen. In our opinion, you can't really analyze just the Democratic Party or just the Republican Party in isolation. They are essentially fused together, having worked closely together for decades as part of a system which seeks primarily to keep capitalists in control and workers suppressed. Democrats are absolutely part of that system. They're not fighting for workers. They are fighting to keep capitalists in power. Part of the strategy, you consider it good cop, bad cop. The bad cop comes out and is overtly hostile to you. The good cop, while still out to bust you, is pretending to be your friend. That is the illusion, that is the psyop, that is the system of control that the people who own the economy and everything in society have set up to keep us running in circles over and over and over again. Now, already half of the country doesn't vote for either Democrats or Republicans, and although they don't have much power, the Libertarian Party is, I would say, even worse than either of those parties, and they're the third largest party in the country. So that system is pretty much sewn up tight, although half the country has also dropped out of it, having realized at some point in the last, 50 years, that neither party is really doing anything for them. In fact, they are leading us to the slaughter. Now, enter people like Bernie Sanders, AOC, the rest of the squad. There's always been a progressive contingent who says, hey, we can work within the Democratic Party, we can take it over. And, how's that been going? Because that effort's been going on for a very long time. For anyone paying attention, you saw that Bernie Sanders got blatantly cheated twice in the 2016 and the 2020 Democratic primary, and he went right along with it. Then the effort was, well, let's pull Joe Biden left, something I'm proud to say we did not contribute to, but in fact attacked here on this channel. You're not going to pull Biden left. He and his people are going to pull you right. And in fact, looking at AOC, what we have seen is a retreat, for example, from Medicare for All. The Democrats, who all claimed to be on board with $15 an hour as a new minimum wage, they didn't pass that. Maybe we'll see it in the next few years. Who knows? But that was supposed to be like a gimme, and they didn't do it. Since January and Biden's inauguration, AOC has made a number of tweets basically attacking critics of Biden, calling us privileged and all kinds of other nonsense. And in fact, if you go to AOC's online swag shop where she sells hoodies and t-shirts and things, you will find Green New Deal merchandise. You will not find any Medicare for All merchandise. which sources tell me was there just a couple of months ago. So all of this is a very predictable falling in line and a collapse in the progressive promises that were used to prop up the corporate-driven, finance capital-driven Joe Biden campaign. And now it seems like anyone attacking AOC at all is really cast more either as a right-winger or Republican or just some sort of like privileged idealist, like, AOC is the most we can possibly do. Well, let's see what she lists as her track record, and then I'm going to ask you, do you think that this is enough given the situation that we are facing in the United States and in the world today? We'll play the whole video and then come back to comment.
Hey everyone, so I have been seeing progressive officials around the world do this challenge where we try to squeeze in all of the accomplishments from the last 2 years in 2 or 3 minutes. And since I'm coming to the end of my first term in office, I thought we'd try to do the same. So 2 years in 2-ish minutes. So let's set the clock. Let's try to do it. Ready? All right, let's go. This term, we successfully passed legislation to move $5 million to treatment for opioid addiction with funds shifted from the DEA, $10 million in funds to clean up toxic bombardment sites in Vieques, Puerto Rico that were getting people sick. I repealed the Fair Cloth Amendment in the House, which paves the way for the U.S. to build more public housing for the first time in decades. Passed legislation in the House to ban funds going to the transfer of lethal military equipment to Bolivia. Introduced more amendments than 90% of freshman lawmakers in the House. I authored and introduced the Green New Deal with Senator Ed Markey and secured 115 House and Senate co-sponsors on it. Regional versions of the Green New Deal were also adopted by 10 local governments, including the state of New Mexico and cities of Austin, Los Angeles, New York City, Boston, and more. We unveiled the Green New Deal for public housing, which would invest up to $180 billion over 10 years and create up to 250,000 jobs per year nationwide. I authored the Just Society suite of bills, which would modernize the federal poverty standard, make immigrants eligible for social safety programs, require federal contractors to pay $15 an hour, strengthen tenant protections, and ease reentry for formerly incarcerated citizens. I introduced the Loan Shark Prevention Act with Senator Sanders to cap credit card interest rates at 15%. I called for the bailout for taxi cab drivers targeted in predatory lending schemes and sought tougher oversight in New York City taxi medallion lending. We introduced the COVID-19 Funeral Assistance Act, which would help families get up to $10K in funeral expenses who lost loved ones during the pandemic. I co-sponsored 78 pieces of legislation that passed the House, 14 that were signed into law, and that's before we get to our investigations. During committee hearings, my question lines helped pressure Big Pharma into bringing down the price of PrEP to prevent HIV transmission, exposed TransDigm, a defense contractor, into returning $16.1 million in price gouge profits to the public, pressured Facebook to fact-checking political advertising, and exposed Mark Zuckerberg's dinner parties with radical right-wing figures. We got President Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen, to state on the record that President Trump was engaging in tax fraud and to name other potential witnesses. We overturned the unjust citizenship question on the census. We stopped the deportation of whistleblowers from the Irwin County Detention Center and traveled to the border to expose abuse of immigrant families in detention and the inhumanity of child separation. I was nominated twice in the Democracy Awards, which was the first time a member of Congress was recognized in 2 categories. At home in the Bronx and Queens, we helped over 1,000 constituents with VA, Social Security, immigration visas, and other federal services, attended over 600 events in the district, hosted 25 town halls, and when our community became the epicenter of the epicenter, we mobilized a full COVID response operation, including 200,000 community check-in calls, 80,000 meals to families in need, 100,000 masks to teachers, small businesses, and essential workers. We organized and launched a homework helpers program and recruited over 11,000 tutors to offer one-on-one help for kids in remote learning, raised $1.25 million for local organizations doing COVID relief, hosted 8 training sessions to teach over 10,000 people how to unionize their workplace, form mutual aid networks and childcare collectives during COVID, and more. We launched a multilingual outreach effort on the census, which brought in over $58 million to our district. on the presidential campaign. I co-chaired the Climate Unity Task Force with Secretary Kerry to help shape President-elect Biden's $2 trillion climate policy. We raised nearly $600,000 for grassroots organizations in Georgia and more than $1.5 million for progressives and swing district Democrats across the country. In my own race, I fended off over $10 million in corporate-backed attacks without taking a single cent from lobbyists, fossil fuel executives, or corporate money. We won, and I was honored to win re-election with nearly 72% of the vote in the highest turnout election that New York 14 has ever seen. Whew, okay, that's not everything we accomplished, but it's still a pretty good list. I ran over, and it would not have been, but none of this would have been possible without you all. Your support, small dollar donations, your organizing. These accomplishments are not mine, they are all of ours. And so I thank you so very much.
Okay, that's the video. Let's start to break it down. The first thing I'd like to call your attention to is what I think is a fairly sneaky piece of sleight of hand, which I didn't notice immediately the first time around. However, watching the video, about halfway through, I realized that at some point, AOC had switched from talking about legislation that she had passed to things that she had, quote, authored and introduced, or, quote, unveiled, or authored, or, quote, called for. And then I backed it up and I realized only the first 4 items were things that she had actually passed. Those were the $5 million to opioid addiction treatment, money that was moved out of the DEA's budget, $10 million to clean up toxic bombardment sites in Vieques, repealed the Faircloth Amendment in the House, paving the way for building more public housing, and banning funds leading to the transfer of military equipment to Bolivia. Now, all 4 of those things are great. We want more money for opioid addiction. The DEA doesn't need so much money. The USA, my God, the Vieques thing. So that, I watched a documentary on that years ago. Basically, the U.S. Navy, I believe it was, would use that site for testing bombing, and it is extensively polluted, and people live there. It's not good. So cleaning that up, tremendous, can't argue with that. Also repealing the Faircloth Amendment in the House. So the Faircloth Amendment, what that is, basically this was passed in the late 90s during the Gingrich Congress, Bill Clinton presidency, basically said that the USA could not add any new units. Like, they couldn't have a net increase in the amount of units of public housing. That was not so good. So, yeah, of course, get rid of that so that maybe we can build some more public housing. No problems there. And also banning funds leading to the transfer of military weapons to Bolivia, where, of course, there was that whole coup a couple of years ago. Terrible situation. Great. But while $5 million for opioid addiction treatment is going to impact some individuals, it is not a sweeping systemic change. Neither is the cleanup of the toxic bombardment sites, $10 million. The banning of the military equipment to Bolivia, I think, is interesting because it's literally the only foreign policy related thing on the entire list. The entire list. Not just these first 4, but the entire list. This is a huge, criticism that socialists make of social democrats in general, which is that social democracy still runs on imperialism. Imperialism, the stock markets, all of it, it's a global system, and the first world collectively that exploits the developing world for profit relies on the U.S. war machine, the military muscle of the United States to do its dirt. And if we don't, fundamentally attack and change this, you have the same system at the end of the day. You're just sort of like changing how you distribute some of that exploited wealth within the first world. And really, first world leftists, probably most of you are not Marxists, need to start thinking in terms of the global working class, not just yourselves, because the situation in the United States, while it sucks, is not the same as being a worker in the developing world. And this country, the United States, is harming those countries in ways that we have never experienced in the United States, even the most oppressed communities in the United States. And there is certainly a gradient of that, whether it's rural poverty, communities of color, whatever it is. There is definitely, not homogeneity within the oppression levels of the U.S. working class. But even the most oppressed segments of the U.S. working class still have it better than most of the global proletariat. So we need to start thinking a lot more about foreign policy and the international system of empire, which really is just not on this list other than the Bolivia item. So that leaves the fourth item, which is the Faircloth Amendment. Now that could lead domestically to some more sweeping reforms. For example, we have a gigantic housing crisis in the United States. It's not exclusive to the United States. Every time that I do searches on this, there's also a huge housing crisis in the UK, where, for example, house prices have been rising something like 8 times faster than wages have. If you're a millennial who had boomer parents who maybe bought their first house about 30 years ago, say in the early 90s, if you try to buy that exact same house today, it is probably on average 3 or 4 times more expensive. So a house that might have gone for $100,000 then is going for $300,000 or $400,000 now. Keeping in mind that the house was new or closer to new then, and it's 30 years older now, yet that's the way it is in 2021. These prices are being driven in part by an absolute shortage of houses. There are way fewer houses than there is demand for houses. Building more public housing absolutely would help to alleviate some of that supply problem. I would say that is, to me, probably the most significant thing on this list. However, it is a preliminary step. They still have to actually pass more legislation to actually build the housing that they are now allowed to build. So those are the 4 things that got done. We also have the authored and introduced or called for section. Some of these are fairly small. The COVID-19 Funeral Assistance Act, okay, great, not arguing, but it's not systemic. It's not a huge change. The bailout for cab drivers targeted in predatory lending schemes is oddly specific. Most people are not cab drivers, more power to cab drivers. But in fact, I thought she was going to say something about Uber and Lyft. This is just, anyway. Also, the Loan Shark Prevention Act, capping credit card interest rates at 15%. What the fuck? I mean, I guess it's a step forward, but 15% is not good anyway. This leads us to the Green New Deal and the Just Society suite of bills, which are probably the most significant in terms of sweeping changes. You know, if we're looking for revolutionary change, whether it's broad reforms or, ultimately something that's on the path to revolution, whatever, the Green New Deal and the Just Society suite is probably what we should start digging into. So let's do that. So let's start with the Just Society overview because that is more of an AOC specific thing, and then we'll go to the Green New Deal, which is a larger Democratic Party effort. I have here the Just Society suite of bills overview from AOC's website. I'm going to read the whole thing out loud. A Just Society. The problem. We live in one of the world's wealthiest societies, yet many of our fellow Americans fail to benefit from this prosperity. The UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights aptly notes, the U.S., quote, is a land of stark contrasts. About 40 million Americans live in poverty, which is about 1 in 10. About 18.5 million Americans live in extreme poverty, and American citizens live, quote, shorter and sicker lives comparing to those living in the richest democracies. So that is the end of the section called the problem. However, from a socialist perspective, from a Marxist perspective, that's a woefully inadequate statement of the problem. All this looks at is competition between imperialist countries for living standards for workers. It says absolutely nothing about, for example, how did these countries get so wealthy? The richest democracies. Democracies, of course, that we as socialists don't consider democracies. They are capitalist democracies, which is really only democracy for capitalists. It says nothing about the international military system, which keeps extracted wealth flowing from the developing world into the imperialist world. Nothing at all. It only talks about how the wealth that is exploited from the third world into the first world gets distributed among the residents of the first world. Well, why are you only concerning yourself with people living in the first world? Why, in the leading imperialist country in the world, AOC, are you not talking about the system which keeps the U.S. on top and keeps many other countries violently oppressed by your country? The one that your political party, the Democratic Party, is totally in bed with, all of these military industrial complex companies, all the defense contractors who really it's their system. This is how it all stays running. So we have an inadequate statement of the problem, which really confines the problem to just what's going on within the United States. So of course we're not going to get a proper solution, but let's read that section. Quote, "The solution, our nation can do better. Representative Ocasio-Cortez is introducing a suite of bills to improve our nation's anti-poverty interventions. This package includes the following bills. 1. A just society recognizes and eradicates poverty. The Recognizing Poverty Act," this is the first of the suite of bills, "the Recognizing Poverty Act directs the Secretary of Health and Human Services, in collaboration with the Bureau of the Census and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, contract with the Committee on National Statistics, CNSTAT, to propose a new official poverty guideline. This guideline would account for costs related to geographic variation, health insurance, childcare, and, quote, new necessities such as internet access. This would ensure the accuracy of our current poverty measure, which determines eligibility for much of the social safety net, including Medicaid, food stamps, family planning services, the Child's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP, and the National School Lunch Program." Commenting on that, again, there's no problem with, keeping your poverty standard up to date, current with the times. It's just like keeping your minimum wage standard current so that, the minimum wage is something you are not struggling on. However, from a socialist perspective, this is inadequate. We should have an entirely different system in which goods and services are not produced and turned into capital in the first place, but produced for use. So, it is what it is. And within the paradigm or framework of social democracy, welfare capitalism, social safety net within capitalism, okay, that's a good step. So fine. However, please note the severe, drastic limitations of this worldview compared with an internationalist Marxist worldview, which wants to uplift the entire global working class against the entire global capitalist class, which AOC is sort of by default stumping for here by not calling them out by name. If you're a socialist, it is your duty to oppose imperialism. This kind of analysis has been around for a full century. There's no excuse for turning a blind eye. We need to undercut U.S. imperialism. AOC is in a position to do that. I'm not hearing that. Moving on to point 2, quote, "A just society creates a place to prosper. The Place to Prosper Act would protect low-income tenants and rein in corporate landlords by, among other things, creating an access to counsel fund for renters facing eviction, imposing a 3% national cap on annual rent increases, and imposing disclosure requirements on the nation's largest landlords." So commenting, there's nothing wrong with any of these things. I would welcome all of them. Again, we were talking about there's a tremendous housing crisis. Rents also have been going up faster than wages. This is a problem. I would like to see more in this department, but no complaints per se with that policy. Moving on to point 3, "A just society is merciful." Quote, "The Mercy in Reentry Act ensures that, notwithstanding any other provision of law, an individual may not be denied any federal public benefit solely on the basis that the individual was convicted of a criminal offense, whether federal, state, tribal, or foreign law." Commenting, again, no problem here. Point 4, quote, "A just society embraces our immigrants. The Embrace Act ensures that, notwithstanding any other provision of law, including Title IV of the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996. Comment, that was Bill Clinton's Ending Welfare as We Know It. Continuing, "An individual may not be denied any federal public benefit solely on the basis of the individual's immigration status." Comment, that's great. It does get a little bit more internationalist in terms of affecting immigration policy. Moving on to number 5, "A just society uplifts our workers." Quote, "The Uplift Our Workers Act would direct the Department of Labor, in collaboration with the Office of Management and Budget, to create a worker-friendly score, similar to LEED certification, for federal contractors. The score would consider factors including, but not limited to, paid family leave, scheduling predictability, hourly wage, and union membership. Thereafter, DOL and OMB are to provide federal agencies with recommendations on how to evaluate and give systematized preference to worker-friendly contractors as it makes contracting decisions. So commenting, the labor movement is all but dead in the United States. Ever since the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, unions have been restricted legally from doing virtually anything that is effective in terms of job actions. And they haven't been able to, and then even where they're able to, the union leadership often declines to do, really anything effective that's going to protect workers. I'm not really meaning to overly slag union activists who are actually busting their ass, because it's very difficult work and you face criticism from all kinds of, fronts, whether it's the right or whatever. That's, I'm not criticizing you. I'm criticizing the overall trend in the upper union brass, which has been concessionist for decades. There's a reason why union membership has seen such a decline from 1960, where it was about 30% of the private sector, to today, where it is less than a third of that. A lot of that does have to do with labor law, so anything that swings labor law more in favor of workers and labor unions is great. However, I did just do a video talking about how labor unions are not in themselves necessarily socialist, but in terms of their politics, but they do create an environment in which socialists often can agitate and organize. So they are helpful to socialists more often than not, much more often than not. So it's a good thing. Moving on to point 6, quote, "A just society guarantees the economic, social, and cultural rights of all. This resolution would direct the Senate to give its advice and consent to the ratification of the UN Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This covenant recognizes the right to just and favorable conditions of work, the right to form trade unions, the right to adequate food, clothing, housing, and the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health," unquote. So point 6 is also the end of the document, commenting on point 6. So the UN has a number of landmark covenants and agreements like this. The US famously has refused to ratify really anything in the economic rights sphere. The United States is real big on political rights. In other words, the ability to vote for different capitalist representatives in a capitalist, air quotes, democracy. But anything that actually guarantees housing or, anything like that, they won't sign, even though many countries who have signed these things, either can't or won't deliver on them for one reason or another, but they still sign them, at least as, a statement that, of political values, whether or not it's an empty statement. The U.S. flat out opposes these concepts. So, directing the U.S. to do this, it's fine. Would it lead to any change? Probably not. Like I said, there are many countries that have these things, but then housing, for example, might still be hard to come by. It's formally recognized as a right, but it's not enforced in practice as a right. So this is the end of the Just Society suites. Note, again, all of them basically are on domestic policy. None of them get to the international structure of capitalism, which the United States serves as the global headquarters of. Therefore, it's incumbent on any socialist trying to, enact socialism and capitalism to include that. This is, again, a tragic weakness, glaring weakness of U.S. social democrats, of the Bernie Sanders and AOC persuasion. Their neglect of foreign policy is massive. At most, you're going to get anti-Iraq war type of stuff because, that was seen as George W. Bush's war, whereas the overall effort, the overall war on terror, which really is just an oil, land, and power grab under the guise of fighting terrorism, that's the official policy, we're ending terrorism. No, you're setting up more and more bases for geopolitical control. That's what you're doing. So if you're not doing that, you're not doing anti-imperialism, which means you're not really doing anti-capitalism or socialism. So that would be the criticism there. Now, Joe Biden has said they're going to be withdrawing all U.S. forces from Afghanistan, if I have this correct, by this 9/11/2021. So what have they, they've been there for 20 years now. I don't know why they've decided to withdraw currently, but the U.S. is still involved in military conflicts and military aggression specifically all over the world. Many of these are new conflicts from the last 20 years. George W. Bush's war on terror, he was the one who got branded with that. Of course, it was a project of the entire capitalist class and contributed to by many Democrats. The point here is for you, as a working class person trying to evaluate these efforts, don't be satisfied with the bone throwing, concession granting things. If they're granting any concessions to you, it's because they're trying to buy your complacency, they're trying to buy your consent, and they're trying to buy your obedience and silence. That's what it is. When they offer concessions, they do so out of fear. Note the fear and keep pushing. The strategy here needs to be total system change, not greening a few things up around the edges. We need to remove the capitalist class from power entirely, and that is a change which this system, which was created by capitalists for their own profit, cannot, will never deliver. The only thing you can do is destroy that system and replace it with a new one built by the working class. That is what we need to do. And in terms of setting our political goals, setting our sights on something that we're fighting for, that needs to be the goal. If you set your goal as anything lower, they have already won because you're no longer aiming to remove them from power. Both parties at all levels, plus the libertarians who have wormed their way into some state legislatures, need to be completely taken out of power. And while, of course, in the short term, a less brutal version of capitalism, of course, is preferable to a more brutal system of capitalism, too many people are going to be lulled to sleep by this, having set their goals on the concessions. The capitalists are counting on that in order to maintain power. What do we do to counteract that? We need to expand the base of people who will not be contented with these concessions, who will see through those efforts and who will keep pushing onto total systemic change. I do not have confidence that AOC or Bernie Sanders are leading anyone directly toward that latter camp. I think that this is primarily a reformist effort to, again, sort of green up capitalism and leave it at that. And with that, let's turn to the Green New Deal. So we have here the PDF of the resolution for the Green New Deal introduced by Ed Markey of Massachusetts in the Senate. And you can see penciled in there for himself and Mr. Merkley, Mr. Sanders, Ms. Gillibrand, Ms. Harris, Ms. Warren, and a couple of other people who ran for president in 2019, which leads me to conclude that, like many things with the Democratic Party, this is pure theater. I did a video a while back on the Medicare for All co-sponsorship, and Bernie Sanders was the only person among the co-sponsors of Medicare for All who actually promoted it on any kind of regular basis. Co-sponsorship is something that they can do to say, oh, see, I co-sponsored that. But then they do absolutely nothing else. It's really just the definition of lip service. So what is in the Green New Deal anyway? Basically, it calls for a 10-year national mobilization involving projects such as building resiliency against climate change-related disasters, meeting 100% of power demand in the United States through clean, renewable, zero-emission energy sources, repairing and upgrading the infrastructure in the U.S., building or upgrading to energy-efficient, distributed, and smart power grids, upgrading all existing buildings in the United States, and building new buildings to achieve maximum energy efficiency, etc., spurring growth in clean manufacturing in the United States, working collaboratively with farmers and ranchers in the United States to remove pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector, overhauling transportation systems in the United States to remove pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, mitigating and managing the long-term adverse health, economic, and other effects of pollution and climate change, removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere using proven low-tech solutions such as soil carbon storage, restoring and protecting threatened, endangered, and fragile ecosystems, cleaning up existing hazardous waste and abandoned sites, identifying other emission and pollution sources and creating solutions to remove them, and promoting international exchange of technology, expertise, products, etc., with the aim of making the United States the international leader on climate action, etc. It then goes on to talk about a little bit of implementation. In general, though, all of this is done in very broad terms. Very broad terms. Will we see any more movement on this? We don't know. It's been a while since it was introduced. And I submit that the United States is currently so mired in multiple overlapping crises that, something like a Green New Deal. So also, Ed Markey has been introducing legislation like this for a long time. He was a big proponent of like cap and trade, things that have been introduced and defeated. They're touted as bold measures and then they don't get implemented. Again, what can this system provide? What kind of change is this system willing to allow? Well, you got to look at what can it allow. This is where we get into Marxist analysis of the economy. It's not just a matter of idealist, what would we like to see, and then just trying to cram, a square peg into a round hole. You have to look at the people who own the economy, what are their interests, and can the system deliver these changes? We say, no, it cannot. Look at, for example, how they treated Bernie Sanders. Look at all of the efforts to take over the Democratic Party over the years. None of them have worked. And we need to put our energy elsewhere and build up a left that is completely separate from the Democratic Party, an independent left capable of fighting independent of all the strings put on the Democratic Party. They're an anti-socialist party. Understand this. They are there to block the growth of socialism. And they will dangle these carrots like AOC. She is the carrot monger. But that's the only purpose. They're not intending to follow through on it. As far as the rest of what AOC touted in the last segment of the video, there are some okay efforts. And, one of the things that caught my ear was that they taught over 10,000 people how to unionize their workplaces. Looking at that, I think that was actually like an online seminar. I mean, by those standards, I did similar work, and so did other people with YouTube channels. So what's the big takeaway? What's the point? I don't want you to believe in the Democratic Party. I don't want you to believe that the Democratic Party can be reformed. It cannot. What they will do is circle the wagons, protect Joe Biden, protect all of the capitalist interests that he represents, and they will put people like AOC out in front to defend this system, talking about some minor change we might get at some point in the future. Time's up. Deadline has passed. We, the working class, need to mobilize independently of these efforts. Stop getting co-opted by the Democratic Party, because they will take your time, your energy, and your money, and they will give you Joe Biden in return, and they will give the developing world military invasions. Fuck that. Fuck you if you support that. You are wasting everyone's time. Time is life. We only have so much of it. It's wasting lives. It's destroying lives. We need to pull out of the system. It's not enough, and it will not deliver the change. How are we going to get it? Decouple, first of all, from the Democratic Party, join an org, then let's talk. We have real options in front of us in terms of gaining power, doing organizing for socialism. And again, the Democratic Party literally just exists to co-opt and derail those efforts. Even AOC, who went in initially to, quote, bring the ruckus, in her own words, in this past race was found giving money to corporate Democrats just to keep a Republican out. So that's ultimately where, if you give time and energy and money to the Democratic Party, it's all just going to the same place in the end. We don't want to see that. Let's stop making these same mistakes. I'm going to end it there. Thanks for listening. Thanks to our current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialism for all. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month. Every donation is encouraging. And of course, every dollar helps. In addition to that, the old like, share, subscribe helps too, as well as leaving comments, which helps to boost the video in the algorithm. Anywhere that you can spread these videos on your social media, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, wherever you are, helps to put it in front of new people and expands the conversation. We really need to do this work because capitalism needs to die. Thanks again, and we will catch you in the next video.